Break out the party hats, kids. It is episode 100, that's 100, of the John Huff Podcast. When I started this thing, nigh on 3 years ago now, more than 3 years ago, been at this off and on for 3 years, kids, I had 100 as a kind of a marker, kind of a milestone in my head. And I thought, if I got to episode 100, I will have achieved something. And we almost didn't make it. All right, I shut us down at like 97 a few months ago, but we're back now. We have found our way, and all of a sudden we're at episode 100. And there's a temptation under such circumstances to do kind of a celebratory retrospective, but I ain't going to do that. I ain't going to do it because most of you were here all along anyhow. You know what happened. What I am going to do, which is usually, option 2 for a milestone episode, instead of doing, in lieu of doing a celebration episode, we do a superficial history about goth music. Isn't that the logical thing to do? Now, in accordance with the 100th episode, I am going to make an announcement. Okay, there's a little wrinkle I'm going to give you. I am going to make an announcement, but before we get to that, I want to give a quick shout out to my friends Kelte and Corey, better known to you and me in the world at large as Collective Evolution. Kelte and Corey, dear friends of mine, inspiring people doing inspiring stuff, and they put this band together called Collective Evolution. Over the past couple of years, they've been recording a record, and they have released it. It's called Medicine Music. I was fortunate enough to appear on a few of the tracks, percussion, drums, etc. A great honor of mine, a great privilege, and those two have been great supporters of the program. I do appreciate it. Would like you to go and check out Collective Evolution's new record, Medicine Music, featuring Corey and Kelte, and thank you to both of them for including me on that record and for their continued support of this program. Thank you to all of you. We're going to get to the spooky stuff in a minute. We're going to make an announcement. We're going to do all that on the other side. Hello, you're listening to the John Huff Podcast. Oh, yay. So what's the big announcement, Chief? Here it is, kids. I have decided, along with the release of the 100th episode, I've got a track record now. I've got 100 episodes in the bank. Been doing this for 3 years. I have decided to launch a Patreon page for the John Huff Podcast. Now, I've been looking at all of what I've invested, financially and in terms of time in the program so far, and I thought, what? Maybe not such a bad thing to try and get back some of my output, try to cover some of my expenses here because they are substantial, and, I don't want to do ad reads. I find ad reads irritating and intrusive in podcasts. And, sometimes you pick up an episode of a podcast and half of the airtime is freaking ad reads. I find it irritating, especially if you just kind of get into a flow with a thing and then let's stop and do a bunch of ads. Some people do that really well. Bill Burr at least makes it funny. I find it intrusive. I find it irritating. And so one of the options you've got as a podcaster is to do the Patreon thing. And what Patreon does is allow you, the listener, if you so choose, to support the pod without having to listen to a bunch of ad reads. So my page is patreon.com/John Huff Podcast. You can go there, and for a comparatively very reasonable membership price, not a lot of money, you can, if you so choose, support the show on a monthly basis, all right? And that is completely up to you. This is not a hard sell. This is not, holding you up against a wall or anything like that. The podcast will remain free as it's always been. If you are inclined to support, you can do so via the Patreon page. If you're not able to or not inclined to support that way, that's cool too. You just listen and enjoy the show, and I appreciate you doing so, okay? If you're not into doing Patreon, you can always support me by sharing these episodes, telling your friends, like King's X said, go tell somebody. Or leaving, of course, a rating and review on your preferred podcast platform, okay? That's going to end my sell. I'm just telling you, episode 100, time to do the Patreon. Patreon.com/JohnHuffPodcast. Now let's get to the meat of the episode, okay? Now, as I told you a couple weeks ago, I was down in T-Dot, down in Toronto, playing the Horseshoe with its checkerboard floors. And as we were driving around the neighborhood on Queen West there, we drove by this club, and outside there was a lineup of kids. I don't often see a lineup of kids like that anymore, you know? And a lot of the kids had the kind of a pseudo-goth look happening. They were not full-on goth, but I could see some of the attire. I could see the black eye makeup, and I thought, hey, what's going on in there? And it turns out what was going on in there was a performance by an Australian band called Stand Atlantic, all right? Now, they are not a goth band. I did a little digging, did a little research, want to see what the kids are up to. Keep my finger on the pulse. They are not a goth band. They're kind of a pop-punk thing from Australia, and evidently doing really well, because they're coming almost as far away from Australia as you can get, and there's a line of kids in Toronto down the street to see them. So good for you, Stand Atlantic. But it got me thinking about the whole goth scene, all right? This is not music that I had really given a whole lot of attention to, all right? There are reasons for that. You know, I came of age maybe just a little bit too late. You know, the goth thing finds its origins in the late 70s, early 80s. I wasn't really coming online yet. And when I did, I came online via the kind of meat and potatoes rock and roll thing, right? I came online with Van Halen and Twisted Sister and that kind of stuff. A much different lineage than this whole goth thing, right? So I missed out on it. And then you add to that the fact that I grew up in the evangelical world and all this spooky stuff, all this spooky music about ghouls and death and the dark side, you know, the darkness of the world. That was a no-go zone. Although, now that I think about it, a lot of the lyrics in the Christian music I listened to paralleled pretty heavily with some of the darkness in what I've since encountered in the goth music. You know what I mean? Guess it's all about your intent and perspective, kids. In any case, I did not listen to a lot of goth music. And then when goth came kind of in vogue, I was in high school. This is mid-late 80s. The goth thing, if you were a meat and potatoes rock and roll guy, listening to your spandex bands, listening to your glam rock and roll out of Southern California, you eyed the goth thing and the people who listened to it with a certain amount of suspicion. Why? Because you were stupid. You were stupid and your mind was closed, all right? But it seemed to a lot of us, I think, in the meat and potatoes rock and roll world that those goth kids were like sad, morose, disaffected kids who are up to some weird stuff and probably drugs. And that's just us projecting a stereotype from a place of ignorance, okay? But in any case, I never really got into the goth thing and I never really gave it much attention. Now you fast forward many years later, and my friend Colin, who had much cooler tastes in music than me, tipped me off to a band called Fields of the Nephilim, all right? And Fields of the Nephilim were/are as late 80s, early 90s British goth as it's possible to get, all right? Fields of the Nephilim. And even at the time, I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to Fields of the Nephilim. You know, I listened a little bit, didn't really give it much time or attention. You gotta fast forward many years beyond that even. To one day, I was jonesing. You ever Jones? I was jonesing for something just a little different. I'd been listening to a lot of the same music over and over and over and over for years. Wanted a different spice, man. Wanted a little variety. And so it popped into my head to give Fields of the Nephilim another shot. Now, this is years later, okay? We're talking decades here. And so I'm poking around, and the first thing that pulls me into Fields of the Nephilim was the image, man. Same thing as Ghost. Way into the image before I was way into the music. And I'm checking out photographs of Fields of the Nephilim. And the Goth thing is so much about image and drama, and romance, this kind of thing. And Fields of the Nephilim cultivated this image that they called dust and death. How goth is that? Fields of the Nephilim dressed up like goth cowboys. They had like these weather-beaten cowboy hats and long hair, and they're wearing like chaps and long trench coat kind of things. Dust and death, goth cowboys. Think of a band comprised of a bunch of dudes that look like The Undertaker. How freaking cool is that, man? I am a sucker for a band with an image like that. Loved Ghost's image. Loved the dust and death, goth cowboys, Fields of the Nephilim. And all it takes is one little thing to pull you in, Sometimes it's not even the music. Sometimes it's an image or whatever, a quote you read in a paper, somebody's attitude, but it pulls you in. It kind of opens up your receptivity to a kind of music, So I start digging around in Fields of the Nephilim's catalog, and I become really into their Elysium album, released in 1990, I want to say. And in particular, the last two songs on the Elysium album, they are called Whale of Sumer. How goth is that? Whale of Sumer. Not W-H-A-L-E, by the way. Whale of Sumer, and the last track is called And There Will Your Heart Be Also. It's two pieces of one song. They run into each other, and the kind of motif continues from one song into the next. And what you get, I think, from those two tracks is textbook goth music, stylistically as we understand it. They are slow. There is a repetitive musical theme happening over and over and over and over. A lot of it is driven by kind of a bass guitar line, and then the guitars kind of play shimmery, textural, atmospheric stuff over top. It's very, very gloomy. Very, very gloomy, very, very hypnotic. And then the singer, Carl McCoy, the chief cowboy, comes in with this sort of low, melancholy, sort of anguished vocal. This is as goth as it gets, man. And I gotta tell you, it's freaking fabulous. I reached an evolution, I guess, in my musical maturity where I began to appreciate what was happening here. And those two tracks, that whole record, but those two tracks, Whale of Sumer and There Will Your Heart Be Also, are absolutely freaking wonderful. And then they did at least one, maybe two live DVD things. You can watch them on YouTube. Fields of the Nephilim live, and you can hear them. Great band, great freaking band, great players. And you can see them and hear them playing this dark, morose, slow, dirge-like, sad melancholy, but so dramatic. Goth was so visual, so dramatic. And so out of the dry ice come these undertakers, dust and death cowboys playing this music. Really stunning, really effective, really impactful visually and musically, And so I started to appreciate the goth. Started to appreciate Fields of the Nephilim, and I really do, and I still listen to them a lot because the music is affecting. A-F-F-E-C-T-I-N-G, affecting, Very melancholy, very moving, very dramatic. And the thing is, you have a stereotype about goth that it's all plodding and dirge-like and slow, but it isn't. A lot of it rocks. As we'll see in this little exploration of where the goth music comes from. This is fundamentally a superficial history of where the goth comes from. right? And some of it smokes. Some of it really rocks. You listen to Sisters of Mercy, stuff like that. Some of it gets freaking heavy. And I mean, the later stuff, you get into like Marilyn Manson and PJ Harvey and stuff like that. This stuff evolved into some pretty kick-ass rock and roll. But these fundamentals, slow, dirge-like songs, the shimmery guitar, the atmospheric guitar, the bass lines that seem to drive things, the lower, more melancholy vocal, very affecting and very, very cool. A lot of this music is terrific if you have not listened. But where does it come from? You know, where does it come from? I didn't know, and so I went exploring. The thing is, I was hoping to find a through line, you know, a thread that I could pull that would uncover a deeper cultural or historical story within the story that I hadn't really thought of before. If you think back to the other superficial histories we've done, when we did Disco Demolition Night, it opened up all of these cultural questions about homosexual rights and freedoms and racism in the 70s. The episode about the Altamont Free Concert was about the death of hippie culture in the 60s and how that fell apart. And the Boss and the Berlin Wall was about the fall of communism. And when I started digging into these topics, I began to open up much broader cultural stuff that was interesting and relevant. And I hope to find something like that in the goth scene, but to be honest, I didn't. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, just means I didn't find it, you know? When I was poking around, I encountered at least the notion that the goth scene had its origins in some of the same stuff that we talked about on those other episodes. I don't really think goth was a movement. Maybe that's the problem. I think it was and is a style. I think it is a thematic, visual, musical kind of style. But if you look at the punk movement, they were fighting against a system that they felt was unfair and fake and left them out, right? And disco people were escaping a system that they felt was unfair and fake and left them out. And hippies were passively protesting a system that they felt was unfair and fake and perhaps left other people out. So there was a kind of protest happening in all of those movements. There was something political about all of that. And at the root of all of it was still the bomb. Remember we talked about the bomb and the hippies growing up in the 50s and then coming of age in the 60s under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. This was still happening in the 70s with punks, with disco, and goth finds its roots in that time, right? The Soviets were still over there. This was still in the public consciousness. And young people who grew up in the 60s and 70s were still in the shadow of World War II and the Nazis. A lot of films about World War II and us beating the Nazis, you know? And that shadow of the Third Reich had a particular effect on one proto-goth band of the late 70s that we'll talk about in just a minute. And you get past all of that, the 70s were a rough time for people, okay? Especially in Britain, there were strikes, there was inflation, there was unrest, there was anger, there was the Winter of Discontent in 1978 and 79, gave rise to Margaret Thatcher, and all of this wide-open capitalism, and the Falklands War in 1982. And a lot of people felt left out by this and exploited by this. So there was an undercurrent of anger. This popped in the punks. We already talked about that, you know? And there is always a darkness in the world, kids. So you could maybe say that the punks attacked the darkness, and the disco people escaped from the darkness through dancing and drugs and sex, and the hippies tried to overturn the darkness with passive protest and drugs and sex. And so maybe the goth people embraced the darkness. Maybe we can say that. But I don't think there's anything political happening. In fact, I think in a lot of cases, goth was fun. I know that seems like a strange way to put it, but I think goth was fun for a lot of people. I think dressing up was fun for a lot of people. And I think getting lost in that music was fun for a lot of people. And I don't think there was any real political attachment to it. So that's somewhat disappointing, but that doesn't mean we don't have a story, okay? Now, when we're talking about Goth, a lot of people think that the association is to the Gothic period of history, okay? 12th century to 15th century-ish. A lot of people think, for some reason, the Goth is about that. And it is in a loose way. All right, but there's a step in the middle. All right, when we talk about Goth music and we talk about Goth culture, what we're really talking about is Gothic fiction. All right, this is 1700s, 1800s horror stories like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Dracula and The Headless Horseman and Edgar Allan Poe, right? And Baudelaire. These dark, haunting, creepy horror stories about vampires and monsters and stuff. And a lot of that literature was set in medieval times and in the Gothic period. All right. What the Gothic period gave us was not a literature. Culturally speaking, what the Gothic period is primarily known for is architecture. Okay. So they built, and I don't know how they built them. Maybe I'll investigate that, but they built these amazing, particularly cathedrals. And you've seen them. You've seen evidence of Gothic architecture with the huge spires and the huge kind of heaven-reaching arches and the ornate sculptures and this detailing. Extraordinary and creepy, in many cases, looking stuff. Last fall, I was in Europe and was lucky enough to take a side trip to the city of Cologne in Germany, wherein can be found one of the most famous examples of a Gothic cathedral in all of the world, the cathedral in Cologne. Go after this is over, or maybe as you're listening, go to your Google and Google search the Gothic cathedral in Cologne, and you'll see what I'm talking about, because it's a prime example. I got to visit it. It is freaking stunning. And then you go inside. It's really weird, because all of these cathedrals, I went to a bunch of them. The sculptures inside, there'd be like skulls and dead people. It's very macabre. It's very goth. But the music and the subculture that we know today is more closely linked to Gothic literature and not to Gothic architecture, all right? That's just setting the table for you, you know what I mean? But musically speaking, where does this come from? All right, and in order to discover that, we got to go back to the episode we talked about the Cars, all right? And the new wave movement, which came out of punk. There was this period after punk, that real blast of punk disappeared in the late 70s. Punk fell apart, and then it splintered, and then people felt that it had become too corporate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then punk kind of fell apart, and then we had this period that has become known as post-punk. And we talked about bands like the Cars, taking the DIY ethic of punk and this kind of energy of punk, but trying to push beyond the simple 3-chord structure. You know, trying to do more elaborate things, bringing in electronic sounds, trying to write songs that had a little more musical depth, perhaps a little less political edge, perhaps a little less anger. And the marketing people said, we can't call this music punk because punk was a 4-letter word, literally and figuratively, around Britain in particular in the late 70s. Punk, as we've said before, was a social crisis for a lot of people. So if you're a new band coming out in the late 70s, and you're playing music that is inspired by punk, you don't call it punk. The marketing people popped up and said, we're not calling this punk. We're calling it new wave. We're calling it anything but punk. Because we are not tarnishing ourselves with that brush. So you get a lot of bands coming out playing a lot of different stuff, like indie, underground, alternative kinds of bands. You know, this is the late 70s, all right? The charts are still dominated by your Zeppelins and your Who's and your Queens, and your Van Halens are coming along, and Kiss exists. All of that is sort of happening in the mainstream, but in the underground, in what remains of the punk movement, these new sounds are beginning to come along. And so you get a band like the Cars doing something very fresh and helping to launch what became known as new wave music, which took over in the early 80s, early mid 80s, right? Well, one of the bands that was on that wave was a band you know called Siouxsie And The Banshees, okay? Now, stylistically speaking, people who know a lot more than I do will point even further back than the post-punk period. They will point to the 60s, all right? They will point to The Doors, where evidently the first reference to a band or music being gothic was apparently The Doors, who I gather held some sort of a press conference for an album release in some dank, dark, old cellar, kind of a gothy-looking cellar, and somebody said, hey, this is a perfect setting for their gothic style of rock and roll. And I don't know, like a lot of Doors stuff was kind of bluesy and that sort of thing. Not gothic to me, but if you listen to Riders on the Storm, some of this hypnotic, trance-like kind of stuff, maybe you begin to see the lines. And then people talk about Jim Morrison's vocal style, the sort of deeper, more somber. I mean, he was drugged out. Maybe that's it. And so apparently that influenced people. And then there was another pivotal moment when the Velvet Underground and Nico released their first album in the 1960s, okay, late 60s. And there was a tune on that record called All Tomorrow's Parties. And Nico was like this German supermodel. And she was brought in to sing on this record. And she had like this stunning blonde bombshell good looks. And the Velvet Underground did this tune, All Tomorrow's Parties. And it's very drony, very repetitive, a lot of drums, like a lot of tom-toms happening. And this became associated later with the sound of goth music. Repetitive, droning, a lot of kind of tribal kind of rhythms on the drums, this sort of thing. Not the same sort of backbeat that you hear in, meat and potatoes rock and roll. And so a lot of people look at Jim Morrison's delivery. They look at this song, All Tomorrow's Parties, on the first Velvet Underground and Nico record, and they say this is the origin of the sound of goth. Something interesting happened with Nico. Like she did a record or two with the Velvet Underground, Blonde Bombshell, yada, yada, yada. Then somebody said, hey, Nico, you ought to do your own thing. And so she did. And so she split from the Velvet Underground, and she went and she released a solo record called The Marble Index. And a lot of this proto-goth stuff appears there too. These droning sounds and this somber kind of vocal. And she changed her look utterly. She did not want to be a blonde bombshell. So she started dressing in black and she dyed her hair red. And if you've seen the goth image, maybe you begin to see it in Nico when she left the Velvet Underground and started doing her own thing. And a lot of people point to that as the origins of not just the goth sound, but the goth look. But you fast forward 10 years, the post-punk era, along comes Siouxsie And The Banshees. All right? And I've listened to a lot of Siouxsie And The Banshees over the last week, and I guess you can kind of hear it. I guess you can kind of hear it a little bit. They released the Scream album in 1978, okay? And this is monumental. Like, Siouxsie And The Banshees are held up as a prototype post-punk band and a real harbinger of a lot of things that came after. You know, a lot of threads, a lot of lines intersect at Siouxsie And The Banshees. I don't get a huge goth vibe, at least out of their first couple records. If you listen to the Scream album, you listen to a song like Overground, and you get those toms, you get those repeating kind of melodies, and they do sound sinister. They do sound sinister. There is a darkness, I guess, in the musical vibe. But I don't really get a whole goth tone out of it because, like, the next song is called Carcass, and that's a rock and roll song, and a banger, by the way. Great tune. Carcass by Siouxsie And The Banshees, but then you're like, it's called Carcass, man. And you read the lyrics to the chorus. Be a carcass. Be a dead pork. Be limblessly in love. Be limblessly in love. Be limblessly in love. Be limblessly in love. Be a carcass. Be a dead pork. That's pretty dark, man. That's pretty macabre, and that's what the goth thing is. Go back to those horror stories, the Headless Horseman. be a pork. So it's repetitive, dark, and so yeah, I guess you can draw the lines there. You can see the threads. And later, like on the Juju record, 1981, a lot of people hold that up as like one of the really great early prototype goth records. I listened to it. Yeah, you can see it. You begin to hear more of this shimmery, chorusy, reverby kind of guitar happening. The bass guitar kind of carrying the melody. It's really, really interesting. I don't really see Siouxsie and the Banshees as a goth band per se, but nobody said they are. They are prototype. This is where some of the sounds are coming from. And not just the sounds, kids, but the look. Siouxsie Sue of Siouxsie and the Banshees, started wearing this like dark eye makeup, and her hair was black and it would be like spiky and crimped or whatever. It was the beginnings of the sound and the look that we have come to associate with goth. But the thing about Siouxsie, as I said, not necessarily a goth band, but where a lot of the strings interconnect. And they were, Siouxsie and the Banshees, an enormous influence on a couple of really, really important bands that are much more closely associated with the goth scene. And the first of those is Joy Division, okay? Joy Division is a story all on their own. And the story exists. You can go on YouTube and watch documentaries about Joy Division. This enormously influential and important band that only put out 2 records for reasons we'll talk about. But Joy Division, another English band, and like Siouxsie and the Banshees, influenced by the Sex Pistols, man. This all comes out of the punk scene. It's just an evolution of the punk style, I guess. Very influenced by the Sex Pistols, as a lot of these bands were, man. And so one of the great influences on Joy Division was Siouxsie and the Banshees. And Joy Division's a really compelling story, all right? They are just a group of dudes. They don't look like a goth band, anything like that. But there is a darkness in the music that is kind of chilling, and a particular darkness in the lyrics that were delivered by an extraordinarily complex and compelling frontman called Ian Curtis, okay? The thing about Ian Curtis is that he had pretty severe epilepsy. And that was a real problem, okay? Because Ian Curtis would have seizures on stage frequently. And people thought initially that this was part of the show, but it wasn't part of the show. And so Ian Curtis would be going along. Great frontman. He had this like kinetic style of dancing. Just a kid, man. Just a kid. This kinetic style of dancing and this hypnotic kind of deep voice. Again, that's a gothic overtone. And they would write and play a lot of really dark songs. And his lyrics were informed by this frustration and angst and anguish about the epilepsy. And they would have to take him off stage and get him past the seizure. And then he would be humiliated and embarrassed and frustrated. And how can you go on this way? And that sense began to come into their music. All right? They put out 2 records. And the one that I'm going to talk about most is Closer, which came out in 1980. The thing about Joy Division is that there's just a macabre kind of vibe around the whole dang thing, man. The name Joy Division. Remember I talked before about how the shadow of World War II loomed, and there were in certain places kind of a fascination with the Third Reich and with the Nazis. Well, the band I was talking about, where that really popped up, was Joy Division, okay? The name of the band, the name of the band is drawn from a novel from the 50s called House of Dolls, which was about, at least partially, about a concentration camp, all right? World War II. And there was a wing of the concentration camp where women were forced into sexual slavery, forced to be concubines, and they called that area of the camp the Joy Division. Does it get darker than that? Wowzers. It's a fabulous name for a band. Take away the context. Joy Division is a fabulous name for a band, particularly one as dark as Joy Division was. That's where it comes from. And then they put out an EP before they got signed, their first EP, An Ideal for Living. On the cover, there was like an illustration of a Hitler Youth kid playing a drum. Yikes! This had to have ruffled feathers, man. I mean, you got a whole lot of people who just got done fighting the Nazis. You know, you've got the punk movement, which a lot of people associated with Nazism. And then you got this band coming out with this name that is an allusion to a horrendous notion of Nazism and a Hitler Youth kid playing the drum. They were not Nazis. Ian Curtis had a fascination with the history. All right, this was not a neo-Nazi group, although neo-Nazis did try to adopt them, you know, as a voice for their movement, apparently. They were not that. Ian Curtis was not that. He was just fascinated by the history, all right? And this is how it showed up in the music. Probably not wise marketing decisions, that Hitler Youth kid, but who am I to say? I wasn't there, all right? But what they had was a sound that really began to incorporate what became the goth sound. And you know Joy Division. You know Joy Division because you know their big song. The big song, Love Will Tear Us Apart. You know that song. It's a wonderful freaking song. It's a brilliant song, and it points to what was going on with Ian Curtis, which was not just the epilepsy that was making it almost impossible for him to perform, but he was a young kid, early 20s, married, and having an extramarital affair. Love will tear us apart. And he didn't know what to do about it, man. He didn't know what to do about it. So he's got this band on the rise, all right? The first record's out. They've just released Love Will Tear Us Apart as a single, right? And it's really doing great. Like, this is a band rapidly on the rise, serving a lot of notice. Ian Curtis can't handle it. Ian Curtis hangs himself at like 23 years old. Also a pretty goth thing to do, you know? And then the album Closer comes out, and Closer is a freaking masterpiece. All right? I would not necessarily have got this music, quote unquote, when I was younger. But now that I'm older, I get it. And it is such a magnificent record. It's chilling, it's haunting, but it's melodic, you know? And it is driven, again, by bass and drums, with the kind of shimmery guitars over top, the atmospheric guitars. You know, it's a great pop rock record. It's a great kind of new wave record. But the lyrics, you know, the lyrics really point to what's going on. There's a tune on it called The Eternal. And how's this for goth? Procession moves on, the shouting is over. Praise to the glory of loved ones now gone, talking aloud as they sit round their tables, scattering flowers washed down by the rain. Stood by the gate at the foot of the garden, watching them pass like clouds in the sky, try to cry out in the heat of the moment, possessed by a fury that burns from inside. Dark stuff, man. Ian Curtis was a tortured soul. This dude was a tortured soul, all right? And that came through in the music. That came through in the lyrics, and it came through in his delivery, which is mesmerizing. A really terrific performer. Again, this kinetic dance that he would do. This is not stuff that we had seen before. But they didn't look like a goth band, but they had the sound of a goth band, right? Even if you listen to Love Will Tear Us Apart, it's got that dark edge to it. It's got the guitars over top. It's driven by a bass line. It's got that proto-goth sound. And they were much influenced by Siouxsie and the Banshees, right? And then Joy Division went on to influence everybody. U2, Soundgarden, lots of big bands were influenced by the sound that Joy Division had and the sort of different and experimental styles they had. You go listen to a track like Atrocity Exhibition, this bizarre experimental sound, really cutting edge, but then they were capable of such wonderful melody and such, again, affecting songs. And they were so sad. And this is a tortured kid trying to come to grips with this illness that he has and his personal life falling apart and the guilt about this, and ultimately deciding to end his own life, but leaving behind this extraordinary legacy of just 2 records and a multitude of people, including a lot of goth bands that came later, that point back to Joy Division as where it started for them, or as an enormous influence on them. And so you had Siouxsie and the Banshees and you had Joy Division beginning what would become this goth community. And then a lot of people say the touchstone where goth really became a thing was the band Bauhaus, all right? I have tried to listen to Bauhaus and I just can't get into it. But their first single, Bela Lugosi's Dead, apparently Bauhaus never wanted to be known as a goth band. In fact, when they were coming up, the concept of gothic rock didn't exist. You know, they helped to birth this notion. They didn't want to be known as a goth band subsequently. But when your first single is Bela Lugosi's Dead, and you're all dressed in black, you're going to be called a goth band. Who was Bela Lugosi? He was an actor who in the 30s played Dracula and who was in a bunch of horror movies. He was associated with that dark, macabre, gothic style of film, right? In the 30s, 40s, whatever. So here we have a lament for the death of Dracula, basically. And it's a weird-ass song, man. 9.5 minutes long. Very strange tune. But again, you know, you've got this repetitive bass line happening. You've got a lot of guitar noise, and you've got atonal chords. A very, very deep vocal. Makes me think a little bit of David Bowie. And David Bowie was a huge influence on a lot of these bands, too. The Ziggy Stardust thing. I told you, the goth thing was theatrical. And so a lot of these bands were influenced by the theatrics of Bowie and the Ziggy Stardust thing. Or they were influenced by Alice Cooper. They were not hard rock bands, but how macabre is Alice Cooper, for crying out loud? Or T-Rex, or some of these glam rock bands that were happening in the 70s. They were influenced by the image, by the theater of it all, you know? And goth is very theatrical. And you get a sort of Bowie-like sound in the vocal delivery on Bela Lugosi's Dead, and dark lyrics about bell towers and virginal brides and bats. This is straight up goth, whether they want to admit it or not. I tried real hard to listen to Bauhaus, and I found it just not melodic to me and very noisy. And it's, you know, the kind of music that if you're watching a movie and we're going into a serial killer's lair and he's trapping you, he's playing Bauhaus. It is edgy, sinister, creepy, very unsettling music to me. And their first record, In the Flat Field, is considered by some people to be kind of the first real goth record. That was 1980, and Bela Lugosi's Dead is considered by a lot of people to be the very first goth single. Maybe, maybe not, but the influence is absolutely undeniable. Typo Negative, Nine Inch Nails, industrial bands point back to Bauhaus as a huge, huge influence, right? Now, the guy was Peter Murphy. We all know that. Peter Murphy was Bauhaus, and he saw them more as an art rock band. And maybe you could make that case, but you start getting into some of those lyrics in Bela Lugosi's Dead, and you know, what you got here is a creepy band playing disturbing music, very dark, and it's a goth thing, man. It's a goth thing. Now, the other band, I said Siouxsie and the Banshees had influenced two critically important bands to all of this, is one you know. The first was Joy Division. The second was The Cure, okay? The Cure comes along mid to late 70s, and they come like everybody else, man. They come out of the punk world. They come out of the Sex Pistols. And they're playing rock and roll music, right? And they're doing their thing, and they release some music, and then they go on tour with Siouxsie and the Banshees. And partway through that tour, isn't it interesting, kids, how synchronicities line up? Partway through that tour, Siouxsie and the Banshees' guitar player splits. They can't find anybody else, right? And so Robert Smith of The Cure pops up and says, I'll play guitar. And so he joins Siouxsie and the Banshees on stage to play their set after playing The Cure's set. And his eyes are opened to the power of what they're doing musically and the effect that it has on people. And immediately, the trajectory of The Cure begins to shift from this kind of straight up rock and roll. There are elements, all right? There are elements of what we would recognize as goth happening. They are on tour with Siouxsie and the Banshees after all, but it becomes much more focused in that direction, right? And so what happened was The Cure released 3 records in a row. 3 years, 3 records. 17 Seconds, Faith, and Pornography. 17 Seconds in 1980, Faith in 1981, Pornography in 1982. And those are considered like a substantial goth trilogy. Each record darker than the last. Until you get to the Pornography record, and it's written, Robert Smith is doing all kinds of drugs, all kinds of alcohol, thoroughly depressed. He's become this character from The Cure. Just this anguished, tortured, sad, nihilistic dude writing music, and that comes through in the music. The first song on Pornography is called 100 Years. The first line of that song is, "It doesn't matter if we all die." Darkness, man. Darkness reigns. And I've listened quite a lot to Pornography. I've listened to a lot of goth in the last week, kids. Still holding it together, okay? Pornography is a great record. I am not into Bauhaus because it's too noisy. It's inscrutable to me. The Cure is very melodic. All right. And it harkens forward, I guess, to Fields of the Nephilim. This music is very melodic. It's very effective. And so you listen to a tune like Siamese Twins on that record. Again, you've got the repeating pattern, very hypnotic, tom-toms, very plaintive vocals, but the vocal delivery is dramatic. Again, it's the drama, man. It's the drama. When you look at pictures of goth costume, it had to have been fun. It has to be fun now. It still happens. People are wearing all black and the makeup, and then some of these costumes are fabulous. This Victorian stuff with the ruffles and fabulous stuff. Great image. Very, very cool. It's all theater, all right? And you feel that in Robert Smith's performance. But by the end of Pornography, they're beginning to fall apart. And, Robert Smith, in much the same way that Siouxsie and the Banshees is credited with sort of being a forerunner of the goth style. Visually, Robert Smith, of course, is held up as the talisman in the popular consciousness of people who don't know anything about the goth scene but know The Cure, because they went on to have mega, mega hits when they adopted a less dark and more kind of poppy radio-friendly style. Fridays I'm in Love and Love Song, you know these tunes, right? Big, big hits, sold a lot of records. When you say goth, you think of Robert Smith. And it was when they began to tour on Pornography that they adopted this image. They had been before that what is known as anti-image. So I guess they were trying real hard not to have an image at all, because I don't know, maybe that would make them feel like posers. I haven't looked into anti-image as a concept really. But when it came to Pornography, and this guy is so down, so in the dumps, so dark, he began to adopt the smeared lipstick, the black eyeliner, the crimped, spiky black hair. This is held up as the picture in your dictionary beside goth look 80s. And a lot of people copped that look, probably even people in your high school. Massive influence. This is, they begin to popularize goth with these records. Those 3 records, 17 Seconds, Faith, and Pornography. And it's appealing to a lot of really sad people. But the music is fabulous. Go and listen to the Pornography record. Go listen to Siamese Twin. Amazing tunes, man. This is a really good band. Effective, melodic, really powerful, if you can handle the darkness, And again, later they went on and released some less frightening stuff. Still kind of dark, but more poppy, more radio friendly. So this is beginning to happen. 80, 81, 82, right? But as we saw with the disco thing, a movement, a community needs something to rally around. The disco thing came out of underground dance clubs primarily for men. A place where like-minded people can congregate and begin to accrue a community. And this began to happen in England around 1982 when a club night started happening called the Bat Cave. This was in London, England. Bat Cave, 1982. And they had a very simple mantra: no funk, no disco. That's, for a dance club, that's pretty revolutionary back in those days. No funk, no disco, but what they would play is rockabilly and reggae and new wave and some of this early proto-goth stuff. And it would attract people of that community. It began to accrue around the Batcave in London. And they would wear like bat wing coffin necklaces to identify each other as members of the Batcave people, the Bat people. And suddenly you've got this community happening, right? That's really, really important to a movement. I don't think goth was a movement, but when you start to talk about a community, it needs a place to be centered. And it popped up as well in Leeds at this club night they called F Club Night, and it would move around the city, but the same sort of concept, attracting the same sort of people. So at the Batcave, you'd have Nick Cave and Robert Smith, members of Siouxsie and the Banshees, members of Bauhaus, you know what I mean? They were collecting there, and like-minded people. And then up in Leeds, where incidentally my in-laws come from, some of them, up in Leeds, you had the F Club nights, similar sort of crowd beginning to gather. And you know who was in those crowds? Members of Sisters of Mercy. Sisters of Mercy got its start kind of playing in that scene. And they went on to be a hugely important goth band in the 80s, taking goth heavier, making it rock. You know what I mean? Sisters of Mercy started there. There was another band playing around that club scene in Leeds, the F Club scene, called Southern Death Cult. Later known to you and me, kids, as simply The Cult. That's right, Ian Astbury was part of that scene with Southern Death Cult. And so now you've got communities beginning to happen. And where there's community, there is opportunity for bands to play, like Southern Death Cult and some of these other ones. And then more bands proliferate, and the goth scene began to emerge out of these clubs, out of these club nights, out of these dance parties, out of these communities. You know what I mean? And that, because man, we're almost up to an hour already, is what I've discovered to be kind of the origins of the goth thing. These sounds from the Doors, these sounds from the Velvet Underground, the post-punk thing, mixing in with new wave, dark lyrics. And then what it really takes for something like this to happen is for a couple of bands to be really influential. Siouxsie and the Banshees, Joy Division. It inspires other people, and then it's almost like a pyramid scheme. They kind of proliferate from there. And people get attached to this. And it draws in a certain minded sort of person seeking the darkness, whatever. I've got a good friend who was part of the goth scene back in the day. I said to her, what was the appeal? She's like, I don't know. You just read the lyrics, you listen to the lyrics, and suddenly you feel a lot better about your own life. Which I thought was a really interesting take, because my impression was that people who listened to goth music were just sad and wanted that sadness amplified. I guess some people listened to it and were like, I feel a lot better now. Wow, that's cool. But the goth thing, of course, persists today. We've already mentioned some of the bands that are doing it. And it's really interesting how what was presented in those really early, late 70s, early 80s kind of proto-goth bands gets filtered into other areas. So you had bands like Depeche Mode taking some of these influences and then going the electronic route and being pioneers in that world. And then you had bands like Killing Joke, who would take some of those influences, but turn them heavier, and kind of industrial, and then inspired bands like Nine Inch Nails and Ministry. You know what I mean? It's interesting to watch the threads kind of leak out and how they get picked up and pick up new flavors and become something much different. Incidentally, Killing Joke released one of my favorite songs ever, which is Love Like Blood. Go listen to Love Like Blood by Killing Joke. Freaking fabulous tune. And a lot of this music is freaking fabulous too. If you've not listened to it, go listen to the Pornography album. Go listen to Joy Division. I know a lot of you folks out there, like me, were meat and potatoes rock and roll guys, never gave this music a chance, but you oughta. And I'm going to put some of it on the John Huff podcast, referenced on the podcast 2022 playlist on Spotify. You go and you subscribe to that, and you can hear a lot of the music we're talking about here, all right? It's all collected in one spot. Go check it out. Go listen. You know, I call these things superficial histories for a reason, because I have not even skimmed the surface of the Goth thing. But in an hour, that's what we get. This is where the Goth thing seems to come from musically. It's where it seems to come from thematically. And I hope you enjoyed that presentation. Let me breathe for a minute. I've been working enormously hard for a week, listening to so much music, looking into so many things, trying to cobble that together. Difficult piece to do, and I hope I did it some justice. And if you were part of the Goth scene and I got it right, let me know. And if I got it wrong, kind of let me know too, please. And if you go and check out some of this music, give me your impressions, because I'm curious about what you think. I really like a lot of it. I really like Joy Division. I'm really growing to like The Cure. I think Fields of the Nephilim is great. Go check it out and try and approach it like my friend who, well, it made her happy. And take a picture of yourself wearing black eyeliner and send it to me. I am going to sign off. Before I do that, I want to thank you so much again for hanging in and for welcoming the show back and supporting. I very much appreciate it. You can find me on Facebook at The John Huff Podcast. You can find me on Instagram at JW_Huff. Please do drop me a line. Let me know if you like these episodes. Let me know what you're listening to. Let me know if there's something you want me to tackle in a superficial history. Doesn't have to be music related, by the way. You know, we're wide open here. Thank you for listening. Again, the patreon.com/John Huff Podcast. If you are inclined to support, I am inclined to give you my eternal gratitude. I don't know what I'm going to be doing with that page, but we'll see how it unfolds. Thank you so much to everyone. Do enjoy the rest of your week. Do drop me a line. I'm going to shutting up, and I'll check you later. Yeah.
Love will tear us apart again. Love will tear us apart again.
I feel great. How about you?